One of the biggest areas of wealth is obviously in the real estate market, very unequal at this point. People are on the brink of eviction. There's been an extension of the eviction moratorium in California to end of September, with a possible additional 6 months for lower income tenants. Then this big announcement from Gavin Newsom about paying back rent, back rent 100% to the landlords who are owed by many tenants throughout the state. What do you make of both of those? There's a pretty large critique of that back pay, saying essentially you're prioritizing landlords over tenants. But what are your thoughts on Gavin Newsom's attempt at recovery from the pandemic when it comes to housing?
It's one of the most frustrating things about all the recall stuff is that people are scared to criticize Gavin Newsom when he does bad things because they don't want to feed into the recall. And certainly the eviction stuff, I'm sure you are too, Jane. Of the people that I know who work in the Capitol and work on state level policy are frustrated that they're supposed to sit on the sideline while Newsom does something stupid around evictions.
Because they can't criticize because of the recall. Yeah.
It's really been interesting to see this more socialist side of Governor Newsom and President Biden. In some ways, it feels like we kind of won in terms of the progressive agenda, even if, it's not President Bernie Sanders. There's a lot that's coming out of both executive offices that, frankly surprised me. It's not everything I want to see. I'm not saying it's, what President Sanders would be putting out, because you already talked about the infrastructure proposals that differ between him and Biden. But I'm frankly surprised by the social investments that they are both calling for in this time. And I mean, I hope that it's an indication that progressives are winning the communications game, and that Gavin understands that in order to beat back his recall, that he needs to be supporting the majority of Californians and not the few. That being said, he has been a big shill for real estate, as we've seen. And the fact that we have to fight every 3 months to extend the eviction moratorium and to fully fund the rent debt was incredibly disheartening, given the stories of the tenants that we were hearing from and all the jobs that were lost to keep people safe. I mean, people literally stopped working so that people wouldn't die. Yeah. Right? I mean, that's why people weren't going to work. And we have to support that.
Absolutely. In terms of do you think we'll be okay through September, or if there's not a eviction moratorium? I mean, this is all happening. We remember obviously last year that California couldn't even pass the most minimal, what am I trying to say? Rent control. Just the most minimal rent control we weren't able to do. And again, we've talked about how messed up, NATO and I've talked a lot about how messed up the ballot system is in the state. But without rent control, it feels like we're still just plugging up these holes left by the pandemic. And we're not actually bracing ourselves for any kind of long-term future when it comes to housing justice and keeping people in their homes. I know I'm that brilliant. I just let it sit and just let it ride.
I mean, one thing I will say is that unfortunately, housing and real estate is not treated any differently from other industries, right? So the protections that we afford landowners are the same protections that we see afforded to oil and coal and frankly, all of the corporate industries that you see out there. I think housing is a very different type of good. Than most things that are sold in the supermarket, right? If anyone even still goes to the supermarket, I do. Housing is a form of security. It is wellness. It is, it encourages your mental health, well-being. It allows kids to go to public schools and to go to college. I mean, housing is such an important good, but we don't protect housing at a different level. And actually, that is not true in other countries, right? I mean, we see countries in Asia and Europe where public housing, may house 50% of their residents. And so when it was really Reagan, he was the one to first start slashing HUD's budget, right, back in 1980. Well, it started with Nixon, but really Reagan. And then Reagan, Bush, and Clinton slashed HUD's budget by 50%. And at the same time, as HUD's budget went down, as government went out of the business of building and maintaining public housing, homelessness as a crisis in cities across the country rose. Mm-hmm. And there's literally a graph you can find where, like, HUD funding goes down, homelessness goes up. Literally we stop building subsidized housing, and homelessness goes up. And why is that? Well, I've worked for an affordable housing organization. Folks that are working class, and now in San Francisco, middle class as well, simply do not pay enough in rent to cover the cost of the land, the construction, and maintenance of buildings. That's just it. You can't even break even on a lot of this affordable housing. It absolutely must be subsidized in order for people to have a place to live. Or, the other thing we could do is just raise everyone's income levels, right? In fact, it was really funny when tech companies would come to me, because there were so many tech companies in my district. I served on the board of supervisors. They'd always be like, oh, homelessness is so horrible in San Francisco. What can we do to help? And my first answer was always, pay your lowest paid workers more. Pay your janitors, your security guards, your cafeteria workers more. Yes. Make them all W-2s. Take them off the contracting. And they're like, no, that's not what we meant. Like, we just wanted to know what soup kitchen you thought was good for us to send 500 volunteers to on one day, once a year. Which is craziness. And it's like, your workers are actually sleeping in our shelters. Your workers are sleeping in their cars. Your workers are flooding our affordable housing waiting list, right? They are working for you. So if you want to address homelessness, raise their wages so they can afford to live here. Right. So anyway, it's a two-prong issue, right? One, we used to more adequately fund the subsidy of housing. Reagan, really, ended that by saying we need to make government smaller, let the market take care of housing everyone. But what we found is that the market is good at, I guess, housing those that are wealthy and upper middle class, and maybe middle class in some parts of the country. But they certainly are not good at housing those that are working class and below, again, because the cost of housing is frankly more than what people can afford to pay. So we have to greatly invest publicly in housing, and we need to reduce the wealth gap.
Hey, thanks so much for watching the Bitchuation Room podcast live stream. And while you're here, why don't you just subscribe to this channel? I promise it'll be good.